Today is November 22nd, 2024, and I am honored to have our guest, SGAnon, join us for this podcast. Um, I've got a bio here in front of me, but I really think it's going to be better if I give SG the opportunity to introduce himself. SG, welcome to the It's All Good show.
Thanks for having me, sir. Good to be here.
So I had the opportunity of meeting you, albeit in passing, earlier this year in Dallas, an event we were both at. And you were on the short list of people when I reintroduced my new podcast that I wanted to have as a guest. And so here we are. It's amazing. My viewers may not know there's a segment of people I'm connected to that absolutely know a lot about you, and honestly a larger segment of who I'm connected to that may know next to nothing about you. And so if you could kind of give an overview of who you are and how you got here, then before we do our dive into everything.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I came on the quote unquote truth or scene, online scene podcast, space, whatever you want to call it, a couple of years ago at the bequest of someone who's a very dear person to me, a friend, a mentor, someone to look up to and admire, and someone that I'd known a long time. Rewinding it a little bit further back, let me bring us into how that dynamic actually ended up coming about 14 years ago this year. As a matter of fact, it was 14 years ago, a couple of months ago. I had an awakening experience, not unlike the kind that a lot of people around the world are experiencing right now. They're realizing essentially in a coordinated way and in a very large scale way that the nefariousness in the world is basically oriented purposefully against them to some degree or another, whether or not it's the Federal Reserve constantly stealing our wealth, whether or not it's big pharma fleecing us, profiting off of our disease. There's a whole host of other things that's now beginning to happen at a mass population scale. The thing that kicked off my personal journey in that arena, realizing that there was a very coordinated level of evil out there in the world, that this truly was a planet where free will reigned supreme, that God Almighty is benevolent enough to allow us the free will, such to the point that we could choose our own bondage. It sort of sent me on a dark night of the soul. I was doing a research project in college when I was 19 years old, looking at the cellular effects of the effects that soft drinks have, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, things like that, and in particular the things in those soft drinks, the effects that they have on cellular nutrition and anatomy. And that was the research term paper. It was a term paper, a project paper that I had chosen to do. And so I was doing research for that paper, again, 19 years old, perusing the interwebs at that time, going through my EBSCO-host database, going through the NIH database. And I ran across a couple of NIH studies that had been done with respect to food additive development. And one of those studies concentrated on a company called Senomix, Senomyx, for those out there. Senomix is no longer around as an individual entity. It was absorbed by a Swiss perfume giant in 2017, I believe it was. But that company was utilizing and actually had developed and was selling to PepsiCo and Coca-Cola for use in their colas an additive called HEK 293. That acronym stands for Human Embryonic Kidney 293rd protein sequence derivative. So it occurred to me at 19 years old that we were all essentially unwitting cannibals, and we had no idea that this was occurring. And the other thing that occurred to me in that period of time is the only way to maintain the demand for such an industrial scale operation worldwide was through the Roe v. Wade abortion complex. And when you look through the U.S. bureaucracy, Dr. Dream, and you look at a lot of the other legislations and things that have been overlaid on top of one another, from court decisions to certain immunity clauses and things of that nature enacted in legislations, and especially behind the bureaucratic power structure that exists, you find that this entire complex was essentially legal and that there was nothing that could really be done about it. So it sent me on a journey that eventually culminated in me attempting to join the armed forces of the United States. I got part of the way through that process before an injury actually forced me out the door. I don't claim to be a veteran. I never attained that status. But in that period of time, I got to connect with someone about 14, 15 years my senior, a fantastic human being, a great gentleman. And when we were no longer in a situation where fraternization was a concern and I was completely separated back out to the civilian sector, he eventually turned into my mentor. He had an exposure to cryptologic warfare. He was properly trained and formally trained in cyberspace analysis and signals intelligence digestion. And both of us dabbled a little bit in code breaking. So over the years, I got a really extracurricular training, quite frankly, in irregular warfare and looking at the world in the understanding that sometimes we have to bring the enemy into the house to fully understand the problem and adjudicate whatever that problem is. Now, going forward from there, we of course saw the Trump presidency. We saw tremendous things change and happen during the Trump presidency, not the least of which was an entity that came online calling itself Q. We've not heard from that entity in quite a while now online, but that entity essentially espoused for the peoples of the world in a much more articulate and extraordinarily detailed way a lot of the great understandings, or really large scale understandings is a better way to express it, of what I had been learning over the years prior to that and what my mentor had known for a long time. So going through that Trump presidency, we of course saw what happened in 2020 and then in 2019, 2020, and moving into 2021, we devolved here in the Western world into what I purport to be a military continuity of government scenario, relying entirely on espionage. And if you look at the way that the behavior of the former administration was moving out of that administrative period into 2021, the slew of executive orders from November 3 of 2020, all the way up to January 17 of 2021, national emergencies pivoted around federal mission resilience, establishing alternative chains of command, activating military structures here in the United States, devolving certain authoritative levels, delegating different authorities to different places. All of these sorts of things helped inform what I took to be, very much a sort of a Tom Clancy macro civilizational scale of events happening here in the world. Now, from 2020, 2021 up till 2022, I did not feel it appropriate for me to come out in any way, shape, or form online because I've got a family that I have to care about. During the first Trump presidency, I was really trying to do the family man thing. After I separated from the services a number of years ago, I think it's been about 11 years ago now, I moved back into the civilian sector. I've always been a working man, a blue collar person in many regards. And so, but I have a really, really good academic understanding of a lot of things that I believe are happening now in the world. So in early 2022, that man, the beautiful person that I lost early last year, and I think he was gone way too soon. He actually approached me, over the phone one day and said, there's a lot of issues that we can see happening out there in the world. We're clearly witnessing some sort of, multi-dimensional or multi-angular reality show that's playing out, at different levels and different dimensions across the consciousness of Western civilization. And you're basically a robot. Have you ever thought about going online? And so I chuckled at it and, I teased him about my methodical and analytical delivery. It's sort of how I talk and how I adjudicate and address things mentally. So it just sort of, flies out of my lips. And I said, well, it would have to be in a way that would not, endanger me or threaten me or my family in any sort of capacity. And so I settled eventually rather, on coming out about 5 to 6 weeks later with an audio cast. And it was just, really a labor of love and a passion project. I've been observing over the last 8 years, Dr. Dream, a lot of ebbs and flows within the morality gradient of we the people here in the Western world, especially in the United States. And it's worth remembering that when we see things like President Trump walking in front of the Queen, when we see things like the Federal Reserve building being completely boarded up, and we have lots of different videos across a multi-year span to show that that's true and that situation has never changed, we have to keep in mind that there's much more happening in the world right now that's drawing out that deep state infiltration that gave rise to that abortion complex I referenced in the beginning of the call.
Wow. I appreciate that overview. There is so much I want to talk about, and I'd like you to also be able to kind of maneuver and go where you want with this. first off, just a very timely manner. We've got what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and everything. What's your take on that, and what can you share with us?
Well, it's interesting. The Ukrainian-Russia situation goes back to a number of different pivotal points in years past, and those pivotal points are really directly informing what's happening today. You know, a couple of those major ones that I would draw your audience's attention to are 2014, when we, the CIA, the U.S. State Department, and the Obama administration literally overthrew a pro-Russian, duly elected, democratically elected president there in Ukraine in favor for our person. And it's worth keeping in mind that immediately after that happened, our people began consolidating power inside the Ukrainian oligarchy and persecuting Russians simply for being Russian. Moving prior to 2014, we saw in the early 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union that Ukraine essentially was piecemealed or shoehorned away from Russia proper as one of the conditions for NATO to not expand any further east. If you remember, and your audience will remember too, I believe it was the H.W. Bush administration, or perhaps it was Clinton, I forget which one, but the statement was made, not one more inch east will NATO move. And in that period of time, they've not moved an inch, Dr. Dream, they've moved 1,105 miles. So understanding then that Russia, you know, has a pretty significant recent history skin in the game with what's going on essentially what amounts to their border state. It's no different than Texas becoming a breakaway province here in the United States and us agreeing to just let well alone and let Texas do its thing. And now all of a sudden China is schmoozing Texas and sticking their military installations and doing biological and chemical weapons research in that Texan countryside. We would clearly have a huge problem with that, irrespective of where the Texans believe themselves to be. Much is the same, or much is true, I should say, of the Ukrainian population. Over 70% of that population group, as recently as 2016, participated in a referendum where they identified themselves first as Russian and then culturally as Ukrainian. In other words, from that population demographic, they don't really view one another as separate. They're Slavic brothers. They've always been Slavic brothers. And the history in that area of the world, going back to Mother Russia, is more than 700 years old in its current form. So looking at the recent events married with the history, it's not a surprise then that after Trump left office and we saw such weak, inept, incompetent leadership at the very top of U.S. military command and at the very top of the U.S. executive, that this was the opportunity in the eyes of Moscow to begin rectifying the 47 biological laboratories that the U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. CIA, and the U.S. State Department, along with the U.S. aid program, were all funding and participating in there in the Ukrainian countryside, a couple of which were building Slavic-specific genomic weapons. So looking at that and understanding that, that was one of the major things that had to happen. So that was the opportunity again in 2022 for Russia to go in and begin to take care of that. Another major factor that's happening with respect to the Ukrainian war, and what is soon to be, I believe, an expanded war because of the actions of NATO and the ancestral interests of the Baltic states, relates to the underground systems. We have a tremendous amount of catacomb systems beneath Eastern Europe that have been utilized for all sorts of criminality that would take really too long, to itemize out on a broadcast like this. And all of that has been happening in and around the western and southwestern Russian border. And some of those catacombs tie directly into Russian provinces and go all the way up to modern day St. Petersburg, what was formerly Leningrad. So they have a vested interest in getting the NATO component out of that sandbox right on their border, removing the military industrial complex from that border, exposing the criminality that they've been committing in violation of every single international convention since 1949, and also addressing the issue of severe criminality and attempted co-opting of their government. Right, we have to remember that Russian oligarchs exist just like Washington, D.C. oligarchs exist. A lot of their parliamentarians are bought off by the same interests that buy off our parliamentarians and our congresspeople and our elected, so-called selected representatives. So looking at that and understanding that this was the opportunity, with the weakness on our side, with the failure to start happening in the NATO countries, with the inflation out of control, paralyzing their ability to respond, and certainly to bring industry online to counter whatever Russia was doing, I think that we can, sort of see, Dr. Dream, how this would have been. It's kind of like a perfect storm scenario. And I'm expecting that storm to expand a little bit here in the coming days and weeks, primarily because of the actions of NATO seeking to avoid the very accountability that Russia has been exposing, that the Western population groups have been exposing, and that the populations within those Western nations are now hungering for.
So what do you think happens? I mean, from your perspective, what happens in the next 2.5 months before Trump takes office?
That's a really difficult prognostication. There's so many different things that could happen. We've got China and Taiwan, which is a conflict that is yet to begin, but will absolutely begin before this process is over, because prior to the 20th century, Taiwan and China were one China. They were one nation. There was no ethnic difference there. It was the exact same sort of scenario where Chinese first, Taiwanese second. We have this island, it's part of Mother China. And that was the existed situation for more than 1,400 years. So that is one thing that I'm anticipating to pop off potentially in the next 60 days. I wouldn't surprise me if we saw that happen even in early January, and Trump would have to come into office and sort of settle those concerns, or maybe attempt to address that publicly for the world. And there may be some concessions that might have to be made, right? Another scenario where I'm fully anticipating a reunification of the cultures is Korea. And it's very interesting that Pyongyang and Moscow have forged such an extremely close relationship, because in addition to bringing the Russian military support to the Eastern Shelf, which is certainly there in the interest of Beijing, but even more so in the interest of Pyongyang, it also allows the North Koreans, for the first time in 70 years, to have private military communications on Russian-hosted satellite and technology systems that are not co-opted or surveilled by Seoul, Beijing, or Tokyo, which are your main regional powers. And then you've got the Okinawa base, which is an enormous American military installation in the Western Pacific. So those two scenarios, it's very possible that they could go full public and begin to ignite sometime in the next 60 days. I'm expecting the Ukraine-NATO situation to become more of a shooting match between some of these nations, not in a full-scale ICBM nuclear war scenario. I'm not purporting that, but I'm saying precise military strikes, tete-a-tete types of things. If you can shoot a missile into my country, I can shoot a missile into yours kind of situation. I'm expecting that to happen in this period of time. And really what we're creating in this transitory period, Dr. Dream, is the need for a statesman here in the United States and in the Western world who is not controlled, bought off, influenced, or paid by either the intelligence community, any sort of religious zealotry at the top of government, and the defense industry and the very large finance world. And I think President Trump represents someone who, at least, certainly on its face, is meets two of those criteria. I think we're waiting to see about one of those third criteria, and that's something that's again, it's on Patriots' minds. But I encourage people to be patient, let some of this play itself out, watch how things begin to transpire and actually flesh themselves out into the world, and that's when we can respond to them in an effective way rather than react and getting ourselves mired even further in the muck.
Excellent. Excellent. So, what else do you see in a Trump presidency? I mean, so much of our American population has fallen to the brainwashing of the media machine, and are still unable to wrap themselves around what's going on. What do you see taking place, and based on who he is putting up for his different positions?
Well, it's very interesting. We're already sort of seeing some, espionage style musical chairs being played. We've watched in the last 48 hours as Matt Gaetz sat for an incredible Senate hearing. It devolved really into more of a shouting match at a couple of different points. And then we saw Gaetz completely withdraw himself and remove himself. And so now we have a very clear understanding of those who are worried about being prosecuted, right? And those who may be, maybe co-opted, maybe not on our side. And it gives President Trump, as an incoming POTUS, the bird's eye view of exactly who is likely to threaten his agenda right from the get-go, versus others who may be willing to come over to the table when essentially presented with the right scenario and situation. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. We've got a number of individuals that have been appointed to the administration now that I have total faith and confidence in. Tulsi Gabbard being one of those individuals, and making her the director of national intelligence is an absolute genius maneuver, because this is someone who understands war. This is someone who's gone to war. This is someone who's witnessed the military industrial complex commit war crimes on the ground that she is no doubt precluded from talking about even to this day, because they all sign NDAs when they go to combat and when they return. So I think that's an incredible maneuver. Bobby Kennedy, and as Secretary of Health and Human Services, is an existential threat to the modern healthcare system and the modern healthcare construct. And I think that's an absolutely fantastic choice when you look at what needs to happen with respect to investigations tying back to a whole number of large scale civilization crimes, not the least of which is COVID-19. I have others that I'm more concerned about, and I'm not going to name them on the broadcast because I would like your audience to go and make their own conclusions. But in those situations, I'm looking at what the irregular warfare advantage could be in this scenario. And a lot of times you're better to simply open the front door and invite the enemy right on in, because they will invite all of their friends, all of their cohorts, all of their network, everyone that is effective by them, and everyone that they're supporting and that is supporting them. And it allows you to see the whole of the mafia that is encircling the property, so to speak. So I think in many regards, that's what we have going on in some other ways. But again, I stress that patience and that need to eyeball things and pay very close attention, but not to react prematurely.
Where where do you recommend people get their news now?
Oh gosh. Really, X has become the best option in the Western world. I get my news across a number of different platforms. I follow a lot of international channels. Telegram is actually a pretty good channel, or a pretty good application if you're wanting to get foreign news, because it's easily shared on there. It's accepted in most of the developed and developing world. I think they're in 106 countries now, or 109 countries. They have a lot of global South connections, which is really important because you have to remember there's been the Western world financial elitist military industrial construct, and then there's been everybody else around the rest of the planet. And there's been this, loggerheads back and forth now for really 300 to 400 years. When you look at the actual machinations going back to the British Empire of how these geopolitical dynamics were ushered into the world. And so, getting connected to those outlets, I watch Argentinian news, I watch South African news, I keep up with news outlets out of Iraq, Zimbabwe, Zambia, India, anywhere that I can get a little bit of information. Sometimes you have to play around with some translation. Sometimes you have to, use your phone and take a couple of extra steps to go over to that Google Translate and try to get an idea of what they're saying. But, a lot of times the images for me will help guide the importance of a story. And I've a lot of times, Dr. Bream, I rely on my discernment too, if it's in a language that I don't understand, because time is really valuable. So do I want to go and translate it? Do I want to move on and come back to it? Do I pin it now and research it later? These are types of questions that I'm constantly juggling in my day to day as I intake the information. But it's really, really important to have a broad array. We have to be hearing information from our enemy. We have to monitor the enemy comms. Believe it or not, I watch CNN sometimes just to see what's occurring there. I can only stomach about 6 minutes of the view in any given situation. So I'll pace myself and I'll listen to what they're saying. I pay really close attention to the X feeds and the social media feeds of so-called celebrities and very large famous people out there, because their behavior also, I think, it helps to inform what's actually happening in the world. Good example of that in recent memory, just over the last few days, is Ellen DeGeneres fleeing, not leaving, fleeing the United States of America because of the types of criminality that she's directly connected to. And those criminalities and things of that nature are no longer a secret, right? So, understanding that we need a holistic view of information. We cannot rely on newsprint. We cannot rely on the main apparatuses. We can gain useful perspective from them, but the bulk of our information really has to come from a combined pie that we've made of all of these different component ingredients from around the rest of the planet.
So you brought up Ellen DeGeneres. There's, so many people involved in the Epstein situation, P. Diddy, all of this. Are we ever going to is the truth going to come out about that? Will people be prosecuted? I've been hearing about all sorts of these things for so many years, and it's always where it's ready to come out, it's ready to come out, and then it doesn't really come out. Now, granted, recently more has come out than ever has, but we still haven't seen prosecution, or I don't even know the details of what Ellen DeGeneres is fleeing from. I can only guess.
Well, without getting too salacious for your audience out there, especially since they're meeting me for the first time, I'll just say that it's a lot more than simple sexual abuse, that there is actual ritualistic stuff that goes on. It's pretty gross. And she's a someone who's been connected directly to that because she has herself publicly shared evidence of that online. I posted a dug up tweet, I think it was from 2016, just a couple of literally wishing P. Diddy a happy birthday and addressing him by intimate nicknames. And where those nicknames were derived from, I couldn't begin to speculate. But looking at the overall exposure and coming back to the essence of your question, are these people going to pay publicly? The answer is yes. Many of them are going to pay publicly, and there's going to be a lot of individuals out there that people are going to be instantly familiar with. They're going to know those names. They're going to recognize that person. My daughter dressed up as that person for Halloween. I listened to that music when I was a kid. Those types of things, they will flesh themselves out, and I think that's why we've had a preparatory period really over the last 6 to 7 years, because the gravity of some of it and the gangster style mafia behavior behind some of it is a lot for people to take in when you're talking about entertainment, politics, leaders across industries, leaders across the music space, the movie space, individuals that captivate the public attention. That's a lot to intake when you're talking about extreme levels of criminality against the very vulnerable, against children. Now, I will caution the audience out there and say that, when we look at this process playing out, it makes a lot of sense through the investigative phase that you would cut some deals with some individuals to protect their families, not themselves necessarily, but to protect their families so that you could get to the next level in the mafia. If you can get the captain to sell out the major and get the major to sell out the colonel, then you go all of the way to the top and you actually eliminate the problem. The problem with that is, in order to get that information at different points along the way, a small concession here and there may need to be made. The entity I referenced earlier online states very plainly that absolutely no one will get away with it, but there will be some that will cut public deals and will not be publicly prosecuted because of the information that they are providing to the broader mission. So I think it's worth noting that, in this period of time, you're talking about pitting cowards against cowards, and some of them are going to sell the other one out, but they need guarantees for their children that were perhaps never involved in things like that, or estranged wives or spouses or other individuals that they don't want caught up in what is eventually going to be a serious public outcry.
We talk about crimes against humanity, and the list is extensive, to say the least. What's going to happen with all of that? What's the future of the deep state? What's where the military tribunals at? Where is all that going to come into play?
It's looking more and more as I begin to flesh out my research, Dr. Dream, that we've had escalating levels of tribunal proceedings and martial law proceedings happening in areas around the United States in military jurisdiction, going back even to the first Trump presidency. We saw in 2019, for example, the U.S. Air Force literally snatch Bill Barr off the sidewalk. This is the Attorney General of the United States, and take him on a joyride in a C-130 with the rear landing hatch wide open. And the man is strapped into a jumper seat with no gear, no non-skid footwear, and he has no ability to communicate with the individual who's filming the entire situation. And to add a little bit of cherry on top for your audience, that open landing bay door had a plank bolted into it. So looking at the clear message there, if you don't cooperate, something may be very unfortunate with you walking off the end of this plank at 14,000 feet up. I think that's a very significant, evidence to show out that these types of proceedings, these types of investigative efforts, really is what it amounts to, have been going on in a multi-jurisdictional format to include the military for a number of years now. But as we move forward, how do we bring out the tribunals for those that are the real problem? How do we tribunal those and adjudicate and prosecute those that are actually in control of the Washington, D.C. deep state, or the London-based deep state, or the Berlin-based deep state, or the Paris-based deep state? I think that's the essence of the mission right now. And I'm anticipating that as we escalate these geopolitical conflicts worldwide, as we move into a scenario, perhaps over this next 60 to 90 days, where there's a serious concern by population groups of all nations to get a handle on the out of control activities of their government, we could very well see military forces step in to prevent a nuclear war scenario to prevent some sort of nuclear conflict and begin an adjudication process that will go from the top down and affect everyone at every level, and especially here in the Western world.
Forward to that. Tell me, just briefly take us into the Brunson case.
Well, the basis for the Brunson case has always been that there was a procedural issue that occurred with respect to that case, that the actual legality on its merits, so to speak, wasn't even the main point that they were making. And there was something quite genius about that. It is worth noting that we've seen the Supreme Court kick that can down the road a number of different times. But if you go and look up the documents actually online, you find that on May the 28th of 2024, there was a petition denied. And then again on August the 21st. So this was prior to August the 21st of 2023, there was another denied petition. So whether or not that actually makes its way back to the fore, I think that's anybody's guess. I think the case itself is substantive. I think everyone should be familiar with it and read it, because it does not rely primarily on whether or not someone did something that was abjectly wrong. It relies on the fact that the proper procedure was not followed for a peaceful and appropriate transition of power, and that amounts to the codification of an insurrection.
So here's a question. Not sure where this one's going to go. Who are the clones? Who's cloned right now?
That's a hard redirect for your audience out there. We'll do as best as we can.
Okay.
First of all, we need to set the contextual basis that cloning is real. Dolly the sheep was them sort of sticking it in our face by cloning a sheep. Remember, that's how they view all of us. Cloning actually was completed successfully as early as 1939 in Nazi Germany. It was refined throughout the war. Experimentation and genetic material derived from prisoners of war and those that were tortured and taken into underground military installations. And that type of activity never stopped. It actually expanded after the conclusion of that war, alongside the expansion, sort of really in parallel with the expansion of the intelligence community and all of the different, worlds. And we saw all the different countries. And we saw that sort of fleshed out with the idea that it was the age of spying rather than the age of, actual warfare. It was this sleight of hand warfare instead of, meeting one another head on. So understanding then that from 1944, I believe, 1943, all of the way up to 1971, you had a number of enormous tunnel systems carved out under U.S. Air Force projects. And for those out there, you can go and actually look up the manuals from the contractors and companies that were contracted by the Air Force to do this work. They're out there, they're public record, they do exist. They go down 5, 6, 8, 10 miles in some cases beneath the surface. There's very deep underground laboratories underneath Los Alamos and I believe it's Rancho, New Mexico. The Dulce Proving Grounds has an underground base underneath it that does a lot of genetic research. The Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah has an underground military installation that does a lot of medical genetic research. And when you talk about genetic research, you're also talking about crossbreeding. You're talking about genetic experimentation. You're talking about extracting extraterrestrial DNA. And yes, they exist also. And we actually have a couple of physical copies of them, physical bodies that we've studied over the last several decades. Being able to extract that and try to meld that in with the human genome, this is something that they've been experimenting with for a long time. And your audience is going to say, well, why would they do that? That sounds absolutely insane. Why wouldn't they concentrate on the very advanced technology, expanding and exploring the solar system? If they're so evil, why not just go conquer everybody? And the answer is twofold. One, they can't, because there are a number of ETs that have extraordinarily advanced spiritual capabilities and extraordinarily advanced technology. And our deep state opponent here in the world cannot stand up to them and would be immediately annihilated. The other reason is because there is an obsession, a religious zealotry that is concentrated and aimed primarily at humanity from the very top of the occultic power structure that sits behind finance and behind a lot of the transnational high level groups like philanthropists, and it makes its way in and out of the UN at different points. And that religious zealotry is primarily concentrated on corrupting God's creation. They literally hate the Almighty, and they hate us because we are extensions of the Almighty. We are, the living embodiment of the Holy Spirit here in the world. We have the ability to divine the mind of God if we can calm ourselves a little bit, move into a prayerful meditative state, get our minds quiet. I call it, my sit down and shut up time. What would you like me to do? What would you have me do? And then we're able to actually bring forth some sort of wisdom. Sometimes it's a feeling, sometimes it's a calling, sometimes people describe a voice, but we can actually bring forth spirit here into this world through the work of our hands and the actions of our mind. They hate that because they can no longer do that. When you participate in the types of dark occultism, and I use dark occult for a reason because occultic just means hidden. When they participate in these dark mysteries of the ethers, these dark mysteries of the quantum spirit that we all live within, they fragment their ability to divine that same wisdom, to come into concert and agreement with that Almighty Spirit. They cannot find the peace that surpasses all understanding anymore. So they have to have us because they have to have connection on how to move the world forward. And they have hated that push-pull relationship for 5,000 years. There has been this seeking to destroy the son of Adam, to destroy the son of creation, the human genome here in the world for a multi-thousand year period of time. And so that ties back, it's a very long answer to your question, but that ties back to why the cloning, why the medical experimentation. You have individuals like HRC or Barack Obama or Joe Biden. All of them had clones as well as body doubles, right? It wasn't just that they had paid actors or individuals that function as security decoys, but each of them had a representative clone that could stand in for them if they needed them to. And the way that works is the primary original matter, the primary DNA that's taken from that is imprinted with the living spirit. So it's imprinted with authority. And then if you clone that DNA into another living being, yes, you're animating the being, you're bringing life and blood flow to it, but you're not bringing the spirit of the living God into it, right? Because that comes only from the conception process. So the spiritual mantle of authority or control actually remains with the original, and the copycat basically has no option but to do whatever it is told by that original. There was a singer, I believe it was a rap artist or an R&B artist, I forget her name, very weirdly dressed, sombrero looking hat, very keenly kept in makeup. And they were giving an interview for, I believe it was ETV, television. And they stated flat out in the interview that I have 4 or 5 different clones, and one of them does this, and one of them does that, and one of them takes care of this for me. And I spend about 4 or 5 months a year out on vacation, in the islands, just having a good time. And nobody knows because I've got the ability to maintain my work life activity and to maintain my public facing facade, and no one can tell the difference because it's my DNA. And the interviewer just laughed it off. Ha ha ha. That's amazing. I guess we all need one of those. And then they moved on to the next question. And it was like for me, it was a frozen moment in time when I first witnessed the interview, because I realized this is the in your face. This is how they do it. This is how they skirt what they believe to be the law of karmic return. They will put it out there for us. They'll blatantly state it, but they'll do so in such a fantastical way that we don't actually believe what's coming out of their mouths, or it's difficult to fall into the belief with any seriousness or severity of what they're saying, because it's presented in such a silly sleight of hand way, or such a almost like a discredited humorous kind of way. And yet when they put it out there like that, that is considered by their model, by their beliefs construct, that is considered our consent. If we know and yet we do nothing about it, then that is the same as us participating or allowing whatever they have. This is one of the reasons Christ said, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Understand what it is that's being presented to you in the world, and then firmly decide whether or not you want to sit on it or whether or not you don't want to sit on it, because your inaction will actually allow it to promulgate.
So, SG, what are some of the other things that have been shared, put out in front of us for our consent that most of people have not noticed?
Not noticed. I think that's difficult for me to answer because I'm a little obsessive and I noticed a lot of things, probably some things that really amount to nothing. Let's be perfectly honest. I'm not perfect here. But I will say that movies like, the Marvel series with highly advanced technology and anti-grav technology, the Skunk Works program in Lockheed Martin mastered gravity control in 1955 with a technology called electrogravitics. And it's basically just a polarized magnetism-based technology, and it's showcased in the Marvel movies a number of different times, not the least of which is the bullet train from the movie in Black Panther. And Elon Musk actually hinted at the existence of those types of technologies and the ability to roll them out at scale during his X space with then candidate President Donald Trump just a couple of months ago. I think it was about 2 or 3 months ago. So that is one thing that's put out there for us to be aware of, and yet we've never moved on that issue. Another thing is the movie Taken, which is it's not an action thriller, it's a documentary. That's how the abductions across the Western world primarily have occurred throughout the last 30 to 40 years. They're very, very good at it. That movie highlights all of the different little intersective nodes between criminality, government, law enforcement to make those things possible, to try and essentially bury those situations and make them go away. And they were showing us in that movie exactly how they accomplished the types of things that they accomplish and what they have been doing to the Russians, to bring it back to that discussion earlier, for about the last 500 years, because they have had, when I say they, I'm talking about our occultic deep state, our infestation here in the Western world has had a permanent axe to grind with the Russians ever since the 10th century, when the Russian Tsar, appropriately named Vladimir the Great at that time, nearly wiped them completely out with a coalition of Slavic nations. So, moving forward in time here, we have to keep in mind that they have always put it in front of us. They love goofing with us. The swirly symbol that people out there are familiar with, you'll remember it from things like the Twilight Zone, other cinema where it's sort of like a hypnotic screen. That's actually a play on what's called the Fibonacci sequence, which is the sequence of creation, but it's also what they have stuck out there in front of our faces because it's become a pedophile symbol to them. In other words, it's a way that they communicate with one another. A lot of times you'll see that swirl triangulated out into a three-sided swirl. There is a three-sided swirl on the side of the NIH building, for example. The Pope recently, excuse me, not recently, it's been several years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, Pope Francis was recorded on video as wearing a pretty large green shawl, is what it looked like. It was like a green overlap. I forget the exact technical name. For your Catholic audience out there, please forgive me. But it was absolutely covered in these triangulated swirls, and that's one of the ways that they communicate to one another what they're doing and what they like. It's a sexual preference thing, it's a pedophilic thing, but it's also about control and again sticking it in our faces, sort of like goofing on us. I could go on and on with different things, Dr. Dream, that are out there that we should pay attention to, but I think the most important takeaway is to remember that they have not done anything without a reason. While they're not good at original divining of what God wants here in the world, they're absolutely expert at following tried and true plans and tried and true scripts that they've had for hundreds and hundreds of years. And those scripts have not changed, even though the power structure and the power shift geopolitically here in the world is forcing other changes.
I appreciate all of that. Thank you. Tell me, what's your take on Elon Musk, since you brought him up just a moment ago?
I don't think we're seeing Elon 1.0, if that's, the essence of your question. Personally, my own, and it is just my own personal opinion, I'm viewing this as an Elon 2.0 that came onto the scene sometime around 2017, 2018. I think the meeting between President Trump and Elon in the Oval Office during the first Trump administration was the reading in of the 2.0 to what the job was going to be, what the mission was going to be, perhaps without specifics, right? It's difficult to forecast exact moments, but simply saying something like, when your opportunity comes, do the right thing. You'll know what it is. We're relying on you to maintain this or that or the other. Elon's had contracts with the US DoD and Space Force ever since Space Force was created. Prior to that, he had direct contracts with NASA and DoD through the US Air Force space program. So, I think that looking at Elon and how he's essentially transformed and transmutated himself in some regards over the last 6 to 7 years, it lends a lot of credence to the idea that at the very least, even if we are dealing with the 1.0, at the very least, someone was read the Riot Act and chose to move into proper alignment with the future of mankind. But again, my suspicion, and it's just based on things that I've looked at and cross-referenced, it very much appears like we may have a double. We could have an actor. It could even be a clone. It doesn't really matter to me. But it seems to be a 2.0 version, and one that is far more aligned with the vision for humanity than the 1.0 version would have been.
Okay. Talk to us, if you will, about digital currency, future of the financial system, QFS.
Well, let's take this is a big question. Let's take this in a couple of different ways. First of all, a quantum capable system of commerce and financial exchange is coming to the world, but that does not necessarily translate to a QFS singular system. And that's something that I've been trying to drill down with people for a long time is we have the essences, we have the underpinnings, we have the foundational principles behind such an entity that are fleshing themselves out into the world, but we're seeing lots of different nodes built up individually across each culture where everyone is sort of moving into a asset backed or a tangibles backed way of exchange and away from a way of exchange that is primarily based on, trust me and everything will be good. And looking at how that process has to play itself out, we have to keep in mind that the rest of the planet has to disconnect from the Hydra dollar first. We have to remove the African subcontinent from dependency on Washington, D.C. The same is true of the Middle East and really with South America as well. And we have a huge intelligence problem in the South American continent with respect to Western world infiltration. That's sort of been the scummy playground of our intelligence communities and our military industrial communities since the 60s at least, but certainly since the 80s and the 90s. So getting them disconnected on their own feet, allowing countries to assign a value for their own resources and then participate in worldwide trade at the level that they desire or don't desire. That was part of this process right from day one with the first Trump presidency. And we saw President Trump actually give us a pretty darn compelling indicator that that was the process that had to happen when he was giving a press conference with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, September, I believe, in 2018, where he stated that we would all be on a level playing field with respect to currency manipulation. We would all be on a level playing field very soon. Well, a level playing field has to result in either the redefinition of the U.S. dollar or the complete collapse of the Federal Reserve System and the institution of a U.S. Treasury dollar. And I think the latter is likely the possibility, the most probable scenario that we're going to see before it's all over. But the rest of the world has to do that first because the Hydra exists here. It's in our living room. All of the tentacles are out around the rest of the planet, but the body of the beast is in Western Europe and North America. And so getting the rest of the planet freed so that they can stand on their own 2 feet first, and then addressing the hydratic problem that we have here in the Western world, I think that's the flavor of things that we've seen over the last 5 years. I think that process is going to accelerate tremendously in the next 90 days. And remember, we talked about China and Taiwan and then South Korea, North Korea, and Japan earlier. The Asian sector is essentially the only thing left that's propping up any sort of liquidity inside the US dollar because it is the Asian nations as a conglomerate together that hold the most US Treasury bonds, that hold the most US commercial debt physically on their actual paper. And when when that administrative paperwork begins to upend and we start seeing the sell-off of those bonds, the defaulting and the downgrading of that kind of debt, potentially in response to a military conflict in the Pacific, I think you will very quickly see a complete fall of the Western world system and the reinstitution, perhaps reimagination is a better way to say it, of a proper treasury balance system, which is what Thomas Massie and others individuals in the U.S. Congress have actually been talking about and deriving draft legislation for over the last 24 months.
So, knowing that all this is going to shift, what is the average American to do if they do have a savings account or investments, or, should we be looking gold, silver, crypto? What's your suggestion on that?
Well, I'm not a financial advisor. I can say that I practice, I call it depression era shrewdness. I learned it from my grandmother when I was little, right? Keep a little bit in the bank, only what you really need to have in the bank to manage your bills, to meet your expenses, maybe keep yourself a few $100s float if you're able to keep it in there. And then outside of that, ensure that your home is prepared for uncertain times in other ways. You could pick up a couple extra cans of food at the grocery store. We always pick up bean with bacon soup. It's cheap, it's easy, it's reconstitutable just with water. You can reheat it right over a campfire. It's nutritious, it has fiber. No, it's not great for you. Yes, it's full of preservatives. Yes, it's canned food from the belly of the beast, but it's absolutely better than nothing. Additionally, having a little bit of water on hand. Plastic water bottles are not our friend necessarily, but when The option is water or no water. Having it there and available is certainly preferential. With respect, you asked about investments a moment ago, things to hedge against the events that are coming. Again, I'm not a financial advisor, but if I've got an extra 50 or $60, I'll buy a couple of silver rounds. Sometimes I'll put $100 towards it and get 3 or 4 good silver coins, just 0.999 silver. Gold is far beyond my budgetary capability right now. I think it's over $2,600 an ounce still, or right around that range, $2,600 an ounce. So that's beyond my capability, and it's beyond the capability of most people. But silver is an example of something that would likely hold value. I can't say it will, but it likely would, because historically it has. And with respect to crypto, President Trump has essentially told us out and out that we're going to have a crypto capable economic landscape going forward. It makes sense. We're in the information age. 89% of our transactions here in the Western world are already done electronically. They're just coming off of an RFID chip in a card, or off of a mag strip in a card. They're not occurring in a physical, real world sense. It's all happening primarily through computer anyway. So it makes sense that we would have a computer-based token tied directly to a physical real world asset, where the two are one-to-one interchangeable and incorruptible. And that would be something that would hold value into the future and would likely be desirable. Now, what those may be and may not be, that's the $1 million and $1 billion question here. I've heard everything from Bitcoin to XRP. I think it's very interesting that we now have a Doge department here in the United States of America, which ties back to that coin, right? The Doge coin. It was initially a meme coin that came out. Whether or not that's purposeful, whether or not that's just a neat coincidence where a lot of people get to benefit from right place, right timeness, I couldn't tell you. But monitoring this landscape and this build out, I think that's the best approach to have towards that crypto space for sure, and even towards the investing space just in general. We know that land values, for example, are way overinflated in the United States right now. And that's one of the reasons that we're going to see the military events kick off, I believe, in other areas around the world, because a lot of the groups that own that land, that are artificially inflating that land, are not primarily doing business here. They're doing business, or they're headquartered in other theaters around the rest of the planet, like Vietnam, like Indonesia, like Taiwan, like Poland, like Moldova and Romania and others. And I think you're going to see a lot of pressure applied to those arenas, again, in that multi-angular approach to bring down that financial, really, it's a financial multi-layered matrix here in the United States of America and in Western Europe. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope that the audience derives a little bit of value from that. It's difficult to prognosticate exactly what's coming with finance, because the only good example we have in recent memory is 2008. And that was an event that they caused, where they had control of every single lever that went into the flow and the collapse, and then the snatching of the wealth, and then the reinflating of the economy, and the rollout of Dodd-Frank. It was a very turnkey system that they accomplished a lot with. And prior to that, you really have to look all of the way back to 1929, which was another event that they spawned off purposefully. So this is the first time since the U.S. Civil War where a financial calamity looms large here in the Western world, and no one really has exact control of how it's going to go down, except for those that are at extremely high levels of military operation that have been wargaming a new financial way of commerce for a long time.
Okay. Med beds. What do you know about the real med beds?
Well, I've seen the patents. I'll put it out there. They do exist. The technology is real. It's declassified from U.S. Pentagon research, likely reverse engineered from extraterrestrial technology. But that last part is a speculation on my part. But whether or not they make their rollout all at once here in the United States and in the Western world, whether or not it's a cascading sequence, I think that's the question that's on everybody's mind. The technology does absolutely exist. I have personal knowledge of one individual who is essentially a high-level employee, is the best way that I can describe it, inside of a major healthcare system. And they have told me personally that they were the secretary for an individual that was even higher up in the system than they were, who was participating in a strategy meeting, basically, on how to roll out next generation technology. And that rollout was impaneled and requested actually by the FDA. So looking at that and understanding that that gives me a pretty good indication, Dr. Graham, that we do have gears turning, that that is a background issue that's happening inside of medical institutions, at least one that I know of, or medical systems here in the United States of America. That gives me a lot of encouragement. I think it's more likely, though, on the pace of the rollout that you see it rolled out in a beta way first, and then likely scaling vertically over a period of 2, 3, or even 5 years. You're talking about having to heal not just COVID-19, not just the damage that came from those weapons, both in the viral form and in the medical countermeasure form, but we're also having to purge our bodies of incredible amounts of heavy metal silica that we've absorbed in the last 50 to 60 years. Many of us, living life over the last half century, being exposed to all of these things, as well as a laundry list of other toxins, chemicals, and environmental factors that inhibit the body and prevent the body from doing what the body is really supposed to do and what it's designed to do. You're a physical being. You have carbon in your body, but you're a photon-based being. We're not carbon-based. We're photonic. We're light-based beings. We have incredible energetic intersections at the chromosomal level and at the DNA level on those chromosomes between literal energy of the universe and matter itself. That's why I say we're animated and filled with the spirit, literally, of the living God Almighty. And so looking at that and understanding that we have to bring that system back into proper function for itself. But once we do, the system will do what it was always designed to do. I think that's the attitude that's going to govern the pace and the rollout of this new generation of technology. And you're seeing different versions of it rolled out, right? Plasma med beds, noble gas healing bed beds, EE system style technology, and relying on scalar torsion fields. You've got other technologies that have been, bioengineered and derived for good for humanity. Extrapolations of very concentrated, plant, quite literally, it's just plants from nature coming into a particular mixture or combination and being put out there for such a time as this. And really none of this was going on prior to 2019, 2020, I think, because we still were existing in the stranglehold of that shadow government upon the bureaucracy. The devolution that occurred in the United States as a result of the COVID-19 international war crime forever changed the landscape because it expanded private covert authority of the U.S. military to operate domestically. And when we say operate, we're not just talking about, boots on the ground, running into houses and snagging, people out that are guilty of crimes against humanity. We're also talking about surveillance. We're talking about electronic monitoring. We're talking about satellite-based monitoring. We're talking about bringing the military apparatus of the nation to bear domestically so that we can get an idea of how big the infestational cockroach problem really is. And I would submit to you that after that 2020 scenario, the good, what we would call good patriotic military forces or good actors inside the U.S. Pentagon were likely shocked at what they found.
Now, on a previous podcast, I had Dane Wigington, who heads up geoengineeringwatch.org. His perspective and truth on what's going on with the geoengineering and how we have completely poisoned the planet. That, amongst so many other things that we've done, what can we do to reverse this? I mean, sometimes when I listen to it, it doesn't sound like it's reversible, and yet that takes me out of my spiritual being and my faith in God. What's your take on it?
I think my take on it, Dr. Dream, would be in the same fashion that I would encourage anyone to meet a Leviathan problem head on. You cannot overcome the problem all at once. It's just too insurmountable. It's been too long in the making. It will take time. Eating the elephant's going to take a few weeks, right? To keep with the metaphor. But the collective consciousness of all of us coming to bear on this problem, understanding that the earth itself is all we have, at least for the moment. There's lots of talk about going other places, but right now we're all here on this rock and we're sharing it together. And understanding also that this planet has extraordinary capability to heal itself as long as we will get nefariousness and evil out of the way. I think those are the two main understandings that we have to approach this problem with. Everything else can come as a result of those. If we amplify, for example, the Earth's natural electromagnetic energy. That is Tesla energy. That is, the Earth is the power source for the 0 point field that Tesla was attempting to harness and convert. That's why one of his experiments with I believe it was a Tesla coil, a very large coil that he had buried 15 or 16 feet into the ground underneath a warehouse. That's why he couldn't turn it off, because it was harnessing such a tremendous amount of energy emanating right there from the soil of our great planet. So, looking at that and approaching it from that way, I think our collective unity as humanity is powerful enough to develop technologies that can purge and clean the atmosphere, develop technologies that can purge and clean the soil, and of course, bringing a stop to the active poisoning process itself will take us a tremendous way down that field toward the end zone, right? That would probably bring us all the way to the 50 or 60-yard line just by ceasing the current activities and reorienting how we treat the planet, how we treat waste disposal, what elements we out and out prohibit from being studied or extracted from the ground, other elements that we lift regulations on, like hemp, for example, because we know it has a tremendous healing property across a number of different, arenas. I think it's a multi-angular approach. It's going to take all of us. We need scientists. We need medical professionals. We need garbage disposers who understand waste management and who understand how landfills operate. We need doctors. We need attorneys who understand how the bureaucracy, created a system to allow this poisoning to happen in the first place. It's going to be a multi-human, problem, I think, or a multi, societal problem by the time by the time we have the real honest conversation about it. But that gives me a lot of courage, a lot of encouragement, and a lot of hope, Dr. Dream, because this planet really is precious, and I think fundamentally there is a bit of a familiarity, deep in the bones of the human DNA that transcends national borders. It transcends national identities. There's this fundamental understanding that this is our world. It's not their world. It's our planet. God literally gave it right straight to us in the garden. He had us name all the animals. To take regency of this world. And so I think in some regards, this is going to be the conversation outside of rescuing and saving our kids. This is going to be the conversation that unites us all across national lines.
Excellent. So for the person that's sitting in the suburbs or out in the rural areas in the United States, what would you say to them when they ask, what is our individual responsibility and what can we do now?
Well, I think that has to be a conversation between each individual person and whatever concept of the Almighty that resonates and comes to them. I look at it from the standpoint and lens of a born again Christian. That's the lens that I approach it with, and that's what resonates with me. But that doesn't resonate with everyone. But what is absolutely true with everyone is we have a hardwired connection to the Almighty Holy Spirit of all things, and that Spirit can guide us quite literally and help us to discern what is passionate and what is important to us. I have people ask me all the time, what more can I do? And I keep telling them, continue to open your mouth, continue to spread the truth, continue to ignite conversations that are interesting, fascinating, and that diplomatically challenge your fellow man. And always remember to spend a little bit of time, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, even if it's 30 seconds a day, to calm yourself, to come into that centeredness and to realize I'm a breathing person. Every time I breathe, I'm saying the name of God. I have to come into a centeredness with that in order to rejuvenate and to move forward. So allow me to do that now, right? And that's the approach that I take in my life. That's the approach I've heard a lot of people take. I've always been taught by spiritual teachers that if you're petitioning the Almighty for information, if there's something you wish to know, a direction that you want to go, you put the intention out there to know it, to receive it, to do it. You have the faith that it will come. And then you sit down, you shut up, and you listen to what God is going to tell you or not tell you, or perhaps take you in a direction that you weren't expecting, but trust the impulse. For me, whenever I'm sitting in prayerful time, and I get an actual blending, an actual impulse from God, I immediately can tell that it's not from me because I have this windedness in my chest. It's like this extreme rush of exuberance and enthusiasm. And honestly, in some ways, I guess now that I'm having this call with you, Dr. Dream, I could also describe it as relief in some fashion, a lightheartedness, a gladness that comes from deep within the chest. And I'll know in any moment in time whether or not that was me or whether or not that was God by how intense it was. And so if I'm trying to seek clarity on a particular issue. I put a question out there and I sit in silence. Sometimes I'll get the clarity with it, sometimes I won't. But the times that I do, I can immediately tell what it was connected back to, and I can move forward from there. That's the spiritual discernment process that's really intimate, really personal for each and every person, because not everyone is spoken to in the same fashion, right? God meets us where we're at. Some of us are capable of hearing something from the stranger in the grocery store aisle. Others cannot hear anything unless they're quiet by themselves in a dark room or in a dark closet, and everything in between. So, understanding that in every moment of every day, we're always being guided. There's always a connection that's trying to impart wisdom to us, that wants to have, that has our best and highest good in mind, and that wants us to walk and talk in an upright fashion, representing the best and highest version of ourselves. I think that at the end of the day goes a long way to helping people understand, well, if that is so, what does the Almighty want for me?
I love that. Thank you so much for that. It brought up two quotes from our mutual friend, Dr. Sandra Rose Michael, and one is, "We are all just one breath away from God, and awareness is our power, and love is our superpower." And it's the It's All Good show, and this has taken us just really to the perfect ending. I appreciate you coming on the show, SG, and I know that I sort of guided us all over the place, and so much of like barely scratching the surface. But I feel that what you've done in this show for the people that will be drawn to watch it and listen to it is a great thing, and I thank you so much, and so much honor and respect for everything that you're doing out there. I listened to one interview you did, and your comment was, "You don't have much of a social life." I don't know how you can have any semblance of a social life doing the level of intel research and analysis that you do. You've been described, I think you described yourself as rock solid bulletproof researcher, and thank you for playing that role, and now, over the years, the last years, really coming out and bringing that to us. You're a valuable piece in this puzzle.
Well, you honor me and you flatter me. It was wonderful to be with you. And really, at the end of the day, Dr. Dream, I just have had a little bit of extra time on my hands at odd hours of the night over the years, and that's culminated into where I'm at now. But what is so wonderful is that there are so many things, especially with these beautiful 3 by 5 inch, screens that we have in our pocket. There's so many things, the sum total of human awareness in many regards, that can be sought at right at our fingertips. But we do have to apply a little bit of effort to it. And I look very much forward to future discussions and to seeing where this collective awakening takes all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to meeting up with you in person again sometime soon. Many blessings to you.
Likewise, God bless all. Stay safe.